The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical hummed at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency Natalie Hayes had learned to tune out somewhere between Kandahar and Atlanta. She moved through the ICU corridors at 0600 hours, her sneakers making no sound on the linoleum, muscle memory from moving through a bombed-out aid station where the wrong footstep could draw fire. Her badge read Natalie Hayes, RN, in letters so small they looked apologetic. Nobody here knew she'd sutured wounds under mortar fire. Nobody knew the faded unit patch was sewn into her jacket lining with field-grade precision, stitches as tight as the secrets she carried. Room for 47 was her real assignment. The man in the bed, name officially redacted, identity nested inside 3 layers of Pentagon bureaucracy, had agreed to testify about black site medical experiments. He was a former CIA contractor, the kind of asset who didn't exist on paper until he did. Natalie checked his full line with the kind of meticulous attention that would have made her combat medic instructors proud. The dressing around his central line was clean. His vitals stable. She touched the small scar on her left forearm, a reminder of shrapnel from a mortar round that had found its way through the aid station wall in 2013. Pain is data, she'd been taught. Every scar tells a story about survival. She didn't notice Dr. Mercer watching her from the nurse's station until he was already moving toward her, a folder tucked under his arm like a weapon he hadn't decided how to use yet. His smile arrived half a second before his words, and that delay meant something. It always did. She'd learned in 3 years of service that the worst threats came wrapped in courtesy, the way IEDs were hidden in fruit carts. Captain, I mean, Natalie. His voice had the oily precision of someone used to being obeyed. A word in the hallway. She followed. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and the particular exhaustion that settles into hospital walls at dawn when the night shift is dissolving and the day shift hasn't arrived yet. Mercer's shoes clicked against the tile in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. "You're charting," he said, opening the folder. "It's remarkably thorough. Standard of care requires thorough documentation. Our other nurses manage fine with considerably less detail." He tapped a page with his index finger. "You seem to catch things. Small discrepancies. Dosages that don't match the physician's orders." Natalie's jaw tightened. Not from fear, she'd been trained out of fear in 2009, but from recognition. He wasn't asking questions. He was making statements. He was circling. A predator establishing territory before the actual hunt began. "I document what I observe," she said. "That's the job." "Indeed. Very thorough." He closed the folder. "Some might call it excessive. But I suppose that's the military background showing through, isn't it?" Her hands remained still. Not because she was restraining them, but because she'd learned stillness was more powerful than motion. Stillness was a weapon. "I served my country," she said. "I bring that discipline to my nursing." "Of course you do." His smile widened in a way that didn't involve his eyes. "Well, carry on. Though perhaps slightly less attentive documentation. Wouldn't want the other staff to feel inadequate." He walked away before she could respond. The hallway seemed to contract behind him, the walls pressing closer. But Natalie simply returned to the medication cart and continued her 0630 rounds. Room for 51. Room for 53. Room for 55. Each patient's vitals entered into the system with the same meticulous precision that had marked her charting in every hospital in Atlanta for the past 3 years, which was exactly 3 years too long to be in one place. That was the worst part. Staying still. Staying quiet. Staying just a nurse while wearing captain's rank underneath scrubs that would never show it. The morning shift arrived in waves. By 0700, Cedar Creek's ICU corridors had transformed from the pre-dawn hush into controlled chaos, doctors reviewing scans, respiratory therapists adjusting ventilators, phlebotomists drawing morning labs. Natalie moved between all of it like water, present but not noticed, competent in a way that made her invisible. That had been her training, after all. The best operatives were the ones nobody remembered. But at 0840, when David Chen walked into the unit carrying a rolling suitcase and a 3-week travel contract, everything shifted. He was lean in the way that suggested muscle memory and discipline, not the gym. His hands moved with purpose. He'd set down his bag with a kind of controlled placement that meant military bearing, not habit. His eyes tracked the room in a pattern that wasn't random. Natalie recognized it immediately. The scanning pattern of someone trained to notice threats, to count exits, to identify the most dangerous person in any space. He caught her watching him. For one fraction of a second, his expression shifted, recognition flickering across his face before his professional mask slid back into place. He was probably 38, maybe 40. He had the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and decided it didn't matter anymore. David's orientation took 3 hours. The charge nurse showed him the crash cart locations, the medication dispensary access codes, the workflow preferences of Cedar Creek's particular version of organized chaos. He nodded at everything with a kind of genuine attention that suggested he actually cared, which was rare. Most traveling nurses treated rotations like paychecks to collect. David treated it like a mission to accomplish. At 11:45, the emergency alert came through the overhead speaker in the flat, urgent tone that meant now. Incoming trauma. Motor vehicle accident on I-75, patient with chest wall trauma, ETA 8 minutes. Trauma Bay 4 was being prepped. Natalie finished her current patient documentation and moved toward the bay on pure instinct. The trauma team was assembling. Orthopedic surgeon. Trauma surgeon. Anesthesia. Respiratory. 2 nurses to start. She was the third, which meant 4s and medications and the 1,000 tiny decisions that happened in the space between life and something worse. At minute 4, David appeared beside her. Up close, she could see the network of very fine scars across his knuckles, the kind that came from hand-to-hand combat training, the kind you got when someone taught you to hurt people efficiently. He was holding a 14-gauge angiocath needle in one hand with the casual confidence of someone who'd placed thousands of them. Chest wall trauma usually means pneumothorax, he said quietly, speaking only to her. You want to be ready for needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Assuming it's not tension pneumo. Which you'll know within about 90 seconds of him arriving. She glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead, monitoring the bay preparations, but his voice had shifted slightly. Lower. More clipped. The voice of someone who'd given orders under fire. You've done this before, she said. Some. At minute 6, the ambulance doors opened and the patient came through on the stretcher, a 42-year-old male, ribs clearly fractured, breathing shallow, the kind of pale that meant blood was going places it shouldn't. The trauma surgeon began calling out findings. The anesthesia team moved in. 2 full lines went in simultaneously, David's needle sliding into the antecubital vein with a kind of precision that suggested he could do it in his sleep. 2 minutes in, the patient's oxygen saturation started dropping. 85. 80. 75. The right lung was collapsing. The trauma surgeon made the call for needle decompression, and David was already moving, already swabbing the skin with betadine, already locating the correct anatomical landmarks by feel more than sight. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space made a sound like a punctured tire. Within seconds, the oxygen saturation climbed. 88. 90. 92. The patient's color improved incrementally, that terrible gray-white fading toward something more human. It took 45 minutes total from arrival to stabilization. The patient was going to need a chest tube, probably a CT scan, definitely admission to the trauma ICU. But he was going to live. The math was simple. He was alive because everyone in that room had done their job with precision, and David had done his with the particular kind of perfection that came from extensive, specific training. When the trauma team dispersed, surgeon heading to call the ICU, anesthesia documenting, respiratory adjusting ventilator settings, David stayed in the bay long enough to help Natalie organize the used equipment. It was the kind of small gesture that marked someone as either very experienced or very well trained. Probably both. That was clean work, he said, rolling the sharps container into the designated corner. Your organization in the bay. You anticipated where the surgeon was going to need things before he asked. So did you, she replied. Yeah. He paused. The next words came carefully, as if he was deciding whether to ask them. Where'd you learn to tie off bleeders like that? She'd looked away just long enough to arrange the medication vials in their correct order, but her hands had stilled. During the procedure, she'd assisted the trauma surgeon with access and medication administration, nothing that required specialized bleeding control. Unless he'd noticed something else. Unless he'd recognized something in her technique that only someone trained in combat medicine would see. I was a hospital nurse before I traveled, she said. ICU work. You pick things up. You pick things up in combat, David said quietly. That's where you learn field medical technique that clean. The fluorescent lights hummed their 60 Hz frequency. Somewhere down the hall, a heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm. The trauma bay door hung open behind them, and through it she could see the next patient being prepped, the endless cycle of Cedar Creek Medical continuing forward with the particular indifference that hospitals had toward the secrets their staff carried. Natalie set down the last medication vial and turned to face him directly. Her voice came out level, deferential in the way she'd practiced for 3 years, the careful tone of a nurse speaking to a colleague with slightly more seniority. I don't discuss my background, she said. Professional policy. Right. David nodded as if this made perfect sense, which it did. As if anyone who recognized that particular kind of training would understand that the people who'd received it had very good reasons for staying quiet. My apologies. I shouldn't have asked. No harm done, Natalie said, but she was already calculating distances to the nearest exit and making note of the fact that David Chen had just become a complication. He'd recognized what she was. That meant he could recognize other things too, the faded unit patch if her jacket ever came off, the way her tactical awareness never actually turned off, the particular quality of stillness that came from having been trained to survive things most civilians couldn't imagine. But there was nothing to do about it now except continue. She pulled off her gloves, disposed of them in the appropriate biohazard container, and moved back toward the ICU to check on her other patients. David didn't follow. He just watched her leave, and she could feel the weight of that attention the same way she'd felt the weight of sniper scopes in Kandahar, the particular pressure of someone looking at you and understanding exactly what you were. Room for 47 was waiting. The CIA contractor in witness protection was dozing, his for running smoothly, his cardiac monitor showing normal sinus rhythm. Natalie checked his vitals and made her notes with the meticulous precision that had nearly gotten her fired from 2 hospitals and would probably get her fired from this one eventually. It always did. Dr. Mercer's voice carried down the 3rd-floor corridor like a tank engine idling in a garage, loud enough that nurses 3 rooms away looked up from their charting. Room 319. The elderly cardiac patient, Mr. Patterson, sat propped in his hospital bed surrounded by 3 adult children, their faces bright with the relief that comes from a loved one stabilizing. They'd been here since dawn. Natalie had checked on them twice already, adjusted the flow rate, documented his improving rhythm with the kind of precision that usually meant nothing to anyone but the next shift nurse. Until Dr. Mercer arrived. Nurse Hayes. A word. Not a request. Not even dressed like one. He stood in the doorway with Patterson's chart open, his signature Rolex catching the fluorescent panel light above. Natalie set down her medication cart and stepped into the room, already reading his body language, jaw clenched, fingers drumming the metal clipboard like a percussionist warming up for something violent. The Patterson family didn't leave. They didn't know yet that they should. You administered 150 milligrams of metoprolol at 1400 hours. Mercer's voice climbed higher. The order clearly states 100. Do you understand the margin of error you just created? Do you comprehend that you could have stopped this man's heart? The 3 adult children froze. Mrs. Patterson's daughter, the younger one, maybe 40, reached for her father's hand. Natalie's voice came out steady as a surgical laser. Doctor, I administered exactly what appeared in the electronic system at 1400 hours. 100 milligrams, as written.
Are you calling me a liar?
Mercer's face was the color of raw meat now, the kind of red that comes from someone realizing their control is being questioned in public. Because that's what you are, clipboard Connie. That's exactly what you are. A nervous little note-taker who hides behind paperwork instead of actual patient care. A coward who documents instead of deciding. One of the sons, older, wearing a Brooks Brothers tie, started to stand. Natalie shook her head once, almost imperceptibly. He stayed. She took one measured breath through her nose. The antiseptic smell of the room, the metallic taste of her own restraint, the weight of her composure pressing down on her like a physical force. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye. Not from fear. From the sheer, crystallized effort of not moving. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Mercer. I document because lives depend on accuracy, Dr. Mercer. Her voice had dropped an octave. Always have. He stared at her for 3 full seconds, the kind of silence where you can hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm in the background, where the heart monitor's steady beep sounds like a countdown to something none of them could name. Then he turned and walked out, his Italian loafers clicking against the tile floor like exclamation points. The Patterson family didn't speak. Natalie checked the foresight one more time, perfect, documented it, and left. She could feel their eyes following her out the door. She didn't turn around. 2 hours later, the break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular silence of people who know something terrible is about to happen. Jennifer Chen, no relation to David, the traveling nurse, was sitting at the round table with Marcus, Paula, and Stephen. All 4 of them looked at Natalie the moment she pushed through the door. The glances exchanged. Quick. Practiced. The kind of wordless communication that hospitals had perfected over decades. Rounds, Jennifer mumbled, standing. Marcus was already moving toward the door. Paula gathered her phone. Stephen followed, offering Natalie an apologetic grimace that conveyed everything. I'm sorry, I can't, you understand, right? 90 seconds. That was the entire evacuation. The room went dead silent except for the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that particular hum that sounded like wasps trapped in the ceiling. Natalie sat down with her coffee, the one she'd brought from home in a thermal mug, and didn't touch it. The ceramic was cool against her palms. She stared at the empty chairs, reading the message in their absence the way she'd been trained to read a tactical situation, isolated target, hostile environment, extract or endure. She chose endurance. The break room bulletin board was visible from where she sat, the official one, where the hospital posted staff updates and mandatory training schedules and birthday announcements. Natalie stood and walked over to it, because denying reality never saved anyone. The write-up was printed on hospital letterhead, signed by Dr. Marcus Mercer, dated this morning. 12 violations. 12. The typeface was official, Arial bold, the kind of formatting that made accusations feel permanent. Inappropriate patient interaction. Failure to follow dosage protocols. Insubordination toward attending physician. Emotional instability in clinical setting. Questionable charting practices. Unprofessional communication. The list continued, each one a constructed truth built on the foundation of a single altered dosage in a computer system that 3 people in this hospital could access: Mercer, the pharmacy director, and the IT supervisor who owed Mercer a 5-figure favor. Natalie's hands were steady as she read it. Hands that had sutured a femoral artery bleed in a bombed-out aid station with nothing but a flashlight and a prayer. Hands that had held lives together literally, with her own 2 fingers clamping a vein while someone else found a surgical kit. Those hands read the write-up and felt nothing but a kind of crystalline clarity. She photographed it with her phone. Documentation. Always documentation. That afternoon, Dr. Mercer stood in the hallway outside the nursing station, speaking to 2 third-year residents about a case review. His voice was loud enough to carry. Some people just aren't cut out for real medicine. They should stick to bedpans and blood pressure cuffs. You can always identify the ones who lack the temperament for actual clinical work. They're the ones who fall apart under pressure, who hide behind protocol instead of making decisions. Natalie was charting 10 feet away, her back to him, documenting a fluid intake for room for 47. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge him. She just kept her pen moving across the electronic tablet, each keystroke another brick in the wall of evidence she was building, brick by brick, shift by shift. That evening, Mercer sat in his corner office on the 4th floor, the one with the mahogany desk and the view of downtown Atlanta, and began making calls. His personal cell phone, not the hospital line. Always smarter that way. First call, Richard Garrett, board member, 7:14 p.m. Rich, it's Marcus. Listen, I need your ear on something sensitive. We have a liability issue with one of our nursing staff. Nothing proven yet, but the documentation is mounting. Psychological concerns, erratic behavior, potential medication errors. I need the board to be aware in case this goes sideways. Garrett owed Mercer for steering his mother's knee replacement to Mercer's preferred orthopedic surgeon, a decision that resulted in a $12,000 procedure fee and a $3,000 referral kickback that Garrett never knew about. Second call, VA Hospital Charleston, 7:31 p.m. Mercer left a voicemail with the nursing director. Hi, this is Dr. Marcus Mercer from Cedar Creek Medical in Atlanta. Routine reference verification on a former employee, Natalie Hayes. We're trying to rule out some psychological concerns that have surfaced. If you could call me back with any relevant information about her tenure there, I'd appreciate it. The message was carefully constructed to sound official while being deliberately vague, the kind of call that could plant seeds without actually stating anything provable. Third call, Stuart Vance, External Medical Practices Investigator, 7:56 p.m. Vance had worked with Mercer before on the delicate personnel matters, 3 of them in the past 7 years, all of which had resulted in quiet resignations and legal settlements that never saw the light of day. Stu, I've got a situation developing. Potential medication errors, behavioral red flags, staff complaints. I need someone to do a preliminary investigation before this becomes an HR nightmare. How quickly can you move? The calls took 17 minutes total. By the time Mercer hung up from Vance, he was already composing the narrative in his head, a mentally unstable nurse making dangerous mistakes, a liability the hospital needed to contain, a termination that would look like compassionate medical leave if handled correctly. He had no idea that every medication administration she'd ever performed was documented to the milligram. Every vital sign recorded with exact timestamps. Every interaction with him witnessed by multiple staff members. He had no idea that the Pentagon had people watching Cedar Creek Medical with more authority than any hospital board could muster. Natalie Hayes was not someone you could simply erase. But Mercer had never been the kind of man to ask questions before moving forward. He'd built his career on the principle that hospital hierarchies were easier to navigate than ethics, that money moved faster than truth, that a doctor's word carried more weight than a nurse's documentation. He was about to learn otherwise. That night, Natalie's secure phone, the one buried in the lining of her jacket, the one with a direct connection to a Pentagon number that didn't officially exist, received a coded message from her handler, witness testimony window closing. Primary target transferred to federal custody next week. Maintain cover. Stand by for extraction protocol. She deleted the message, placed the phone back in the jacket she'd hung in the closet, and sat on the edge of her bed in the small apartment she'd rented 6 months ago. The walls were bare. No photographs. No personal items. No evidence of a life before Cedar Creek Medical. Just a bed, a kitchen table, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where her second-hand Subaru sat waiting for the moment when she might need to drive fast. She thought about Mr. Patterson's face as his 3 children stopped breathing when Mercer accused her. She thought about Jennifer Chen standing up from the break room table. She thought about David Chen's voice during the appendectomy. Where do you learn to tie off bleeders like that? The way he'd recognized something in her hands that nobody else could see. And she thought about the 12 fabricated violations on the public bulletin board, each one another piece of evidence that Dr. Marcus Mercer was about to discover that some people don't break under pressure. Some people have already survived worse things than a hospital administrator could ever dream of inflicting. Some people are built from the kind of integrity that doesn't negotiate. The trauma alert screamed across Cedar Creek Medical at 1,430 hours. Code red. Chest trauma. Male construction worker, rebar penetration, ETA 3 minutes. The overhead announcement crackling through the hospital corridors like artillery starting distant, getting closer. Natalie was stocking the trauma bay when the intercom first spoke. Her hands moved to the prepositioned supplies without thinking, the automatic muscle memory of someone who'd done this before, somewhere far from Atlanta, somewhere the sky was a different color and the sand got into everything. She didn't stop moving. She didn't look up. Just folded another drape, positioned the overhead lights, checked the crash cart for the third time that shift because the third time was when you found the things the second time missed. Dr. Mercer strode in with the residents trailing behind like remoras behind a shark. Two fresh-faced second-years who still thought everything would work out if you followed protocol. They had no idea they were standing 3 minutes away from watching someone die or watching Dr. Mercer make a choice that would define the rest of their careers. "Talk to me," Mercer said to the charge nurse, who rattled off the incoming report with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times. Male, 26, construction site collapse. Steel rebar through the thoracic cavity. Entered below the right clavicle, exited somewhere around the spine. Patient conscious but deteriorating. Paramedics wanted to transport carefully, keep the rod stabilized. The trajectory suggested the subclavian artery, maybe the superior vena cava, maybe both if they were unlucky. And they were usually unlucky. The ambulance bay doors burst open. The paramedics wheeled in the stretcher, moving with the controlled urgency of professionals who understood that velocity now could mean survival later. The construction worker's shirt was cut away, his chest a geography of blood and exposed tissue. His eyes tracked the ceiling lights as he passed, and his mouth tried to shape words that his body couldn't find the oxygen to deliver. They transferred him to the trauma gurney with the practiced choreography of dozens of transfers. Cardiac monitor went on. Blood pressure cuff inflated. Oxygen mask secured. The monitor screen bloomed with numbers that told a story in a language Natalie had learned in a place where the nearest reinforcements were 4 hours by Chinook helicopter. Oxygen saturation, 94. Stable. For now. "Get me a chest x-ray," Mercer commanded, his voice the texture of authority layered over something else, something Natalie had learned to recognize as a man who was not accustomed to complications. "And I want a thoracic surgeon standing by. We stabilize, we image, then we move him to the OR. Nobody touches that rebar until we know the anatomy." The two residents nodded. One of them actually wrote it down. Natalie said nothing. She was checking the crash cart, her hands moving through the instruments with the precision of someone inventorying weapons before a mission. Scalpels. Forceps. Hemostats. Cautery equipment. The tools of her trade, unchanged from a bombed-out aid station in Kandahar to a climate-controlled trauma bay in Atlanta. The construction worker's oxygen saturation dropped to 87. The monitor's beeping accelerated like a heartbeat-catching panic. "He's bleeding into his pleural space," Natalie said quietly, not to the room, just stating the fact to the universe and anyone listening. She was looking at the patient's accessory muscles, the way his body was recruiting every possible muscle group to pull air into lungs that weren't receiving oxygen anymore. Subclavian or axillary? "We don't have time for imaging." Mercer turned. His face was the color of someone who'd heard an alarm he didn't want to acknowledge. "Doctor, if that rebar nicked the subclavian, he's got maybe 4 minutes of useful consciousness," Natalie continued, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Maybe 8 before we're looking at permanent neurological damage. The X-ray protocol is correct if we have time." "We don't have time." "You will stand down," Mercer said, and there was something in his voice now, something beneath the authority, something that sounded like desperation wearing a suit. "I am the trauma attending. I make the medical decisions in this unit. You are a nurse. You will act as a nurse." The oxygen saturation fell to 81. The monitor's alarm accelerated into something that sounded like warning, like urgency, like the space between living and dying compressing into seconds. One of the residents looked at Natalie. Looked at the patient. Looked back at Natalie. His face was asking a question his voice wouldn't form. The other resident was staring at the monitor as if watching it carefully enough might change the numbers. The patient's chest was moving in that shallow, desperate way that meant his body was running out of options. The rebar, still embedded, was a physical proof of the geometry of trauma. Entry wound below the clavicle. Exit wound near the spine. The trajectory ran almost directly through the space where the major vessels lived. "Get thoracic surgery on the phone," Mercer said. "I want an ETA. We're moving to the OR for." "Doctor, he won't make it to the OR," Natalie said. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still the voice of someone requesting a coffee refill, someone asking if you wanted cream or sugar. This was the voice of a woman who'd learned that the difference between panicking and acting was somewhere around the space of a single breath. "His stats are dropping. His perfusion is failing. He needs intervention now or we're pronouncing him in the next 5 minutes. The oxygen saturation read 78. The monitor's beeping had become almost a solid scream. Mercer's face changed. The change was subtle but complete, like watching a man realize the ground beneath him was actually a trapdoor. He looked at the crash cart. He looked at Natalie. He understood what she was suggesting, the way you understand a threat when someone speaks it clearly in a language you fluently comprehend. "You will not," he said, and this time his voice had the texture of something breaking. "You will absolutely not countermand a physician's orders in this trauma bay. Not you. Not any nurse. Security." The word hung in the air like a bell struck once and allowed to resonate. 2 security guards appeared in the trauma bay's entrance with the rapid response time of people stationed too close, people who'd been called too many times for situations that shouldn't have required armed men in gray uniforms. The patient's oxygen saturation was at 74 now. His eyes had lost some of their focus. The automatic nervous system was already beginning to shut down non-essential functions, pulling blood toward the brain, preparing for the likelihood of shock. Natalie was looking at the crash cart. She was looking at the scalpel resting among the instruments, the one with the blade sharp enough to part skin and tissue like they were made of something less substantial than human. She was looking at the patient's chest, at the rebar, at the space between the end of established medical protocol and the beginning of field surgery, that liminal space where you made a choice and lived with it for the rest of your life, however long that turned out to be. She was looking at the MacGuffin hidden beneath her scrub jacket, the faded unit patch sewn with field-grade precision into the lining, the only physical proof of who she'd been before she became a nurse pushing a med cart through hospital corridors. 3 years she'd carried it. 3 years of watching officers in suits make decisions while the people who had to live with those decisions stood at attention and calculated blood loss and time remaining. "If you move toward that cart, you are terminated effective immediately," Mercer said. His voice had acquired a new quality now, something that sounded like the voice of a man realizing he was losing control of the situation. "And I will press charges. I will cooperate fully with law enforcement. You will be arrested and convicted, and you will spend the rest of your life thinking about the moment you threw away your career for the sake of acting above your station." The oxygen saturation was at 71. The monitor's alarm had become something physical, something you could almost feel vibrating through the floor. The patient's monitor flatlined briefly, then acquired a rhythm that looked like it was asking a question. The rhythm came back weak, slower, the kind of rhythm that bought you maybe 60 seconds if you were lucky, maybe 90 if the person in front of you was willing to act on something that wasn't in any protocol manual. Natalie stepped toward the crash cart. Mercer moved to block her, his body a physical barrier between her and the instruments. Behind him, the 2 security guards took a step forward, their hands moving toward restraints and radios and all the apparatus of institutional authority. Around them, the trauma bay had gone quiet in that specific way that meant everyone had stopped breathing, everyone had stopped moving, everyone was watching to see what would happen when the person trained to follow orders encountered the choice between obedience and intervention. She moved past Mercer like he wasn't there, like he was made of something insubstantial, like the force of will could rearrange space and matter. The scalpel came free from the crash cart like it had been waiting for her hands. She moved past Mercer as if his voice was just another monitor beeping in the distance, background noise, irrelevant, already forgotten. Her fingers found the 14th intercostal space without thinking. Muscle memory. Combat muscle memory. The kind that doesn't fade, that lives in the nervous system like a second heartbeat. She didn't ask permission. Didn't explain. David Chen's eyes went wide, recognition flickering across his face like he'd just seen a ghost stand up and walk, and then he moved, understanding exactly what she was doing before her second incision was complete. His hands found the instrument she needed before she asked. A level of coordination that only happened between people who'd worked under the same kind of fire. The construction worker's chest opened. Subclavian artery bleeding like a faucet left on. She clamped it with her bare fingers, feeling the vessel pulse against her palm, feeling the arterial pressure trying to force her grip open. 30 seconds. That's all it took before David had a proper vascular clamp in position. Her hands transferred the load. The bleeding slowed. Oxygen saturation climbed, 89. 90. 92. Stable. The trauma bay fell into that particular kind of silence that meant everyone had stopped breathing. The monitors sang their electronic song. The ventilator wheezed its rhythm. Nothing else moved. Dr. Mercer's voice came from the doorway, ice and fury wrapped around each word. You are terminated effective immediately. Security, escort her out. Not a question. Not a discussion. A declaration from someone who understood that he'd just watched his authority get dismantled by a pair of surgical hands that moved like they'd done this before, like they'd done this many times before, under circumstances he couldn't even comprehend. She didn't look at him. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge the security guards moving toward her from both sides of the trauma bay. She was checking the patient's pupils, verifying the line placement, making sure the work would hold without her hands on it anymore. That was when Mercer's phone came out. She heard the first number being dialed before the guards reached her arm. His voice carried down the hallway, smooth now, controlled, the voice of a man who'd already made 17 phone calls to people who owed him favors. Garrett, it's Mercer. We have an assault situation. I need emergency termination paperwork, and I need the board to back me unanimously. This is non-negotiable. The second call came as they walked her toward the elevator. Stuart, listen to me. I need documentation of erratic behavior. Substance concerns. Anything you can build on psychological instability. I'm filing with the Georgia Nursing Board within the hour. His voice never wavered. A man with a plan. A man with allies in positions that mattered. The third call was made while she was being escorted to Human Resources. She heard it through the open office door. This is Dr. Marcus Mercer from Cedar Creek Medical. I'm filing a formal complaint regarding a nursing staff member. Erratic judgment, potential substance abuse, patient endangerment. I have documentation. Pause. His voice dropped lower. I'd appreciate expedited review on this one. Yes. Thank you. HR took her badge. Confiscated her credentials. An older woman named Patricia who looked genuinely uncomfortable doing it stammered something about protocol and pending investigation while a security guard stood by the door. Natalie's locker was opened in front of her. The contents went into a cardboard box, scrubbed still damp from a shift that felt like it happened in another lifetime, the cracked mug that read World's Okayest Nurse in chipped blue letters, a dying succulent with leaves the color of old paper, a photograph of Rodriguez in her medic pack on a FOB somewhere north of Kandahar. Rodriguez's smile, the kind that doesn't exist anymore because the IED took it away 3 years ago and Natalie had been rotating stateside when it happened and there was no coming back from that particular mission failure. The rain started at 1700 hours, drops that felt like judgment, like the sky itself was disappointed. The bus stop was 2 blocks away through a parking lot that smelled like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay. She held the cardboard box with the weight of someone carrying something significantly heavier than old belongings. Inside her jacket lining, sewn with field-grade precision using surgical thread and a steady hand, was the faded patch of the unit she'd saved 3 years ago. The Desert Angels. The call sign no one here knew except David Chen, and he'd stay quiet because people who'd seen what he'd seen understood the value of operational security. She let one tear trace down her cheek. Just one. Just enough to acknowledge that this particular cover was gone, and that meant the mission was failing, and that meant Khalid al-Mahdi, the Taliban commander she'd been watching for 9 months, would be discovered without protection, and there was a Pentagon handler somewhere checking a secure phone right now with hands that weren't shaking but probably should have been. She wiped the moisture away without breaking stride. The mug felt cold against her palm through the cardboard. Her phone buzzed. A secure message from a number that never showed as a number, cover compromised. Witness exposed. Mission failure. Extraction protocols pending. The rain hammered the bus stop shelter like applause for a performance nobody would ever see. She didn't look back at Cedar Creek Medical. Didn't watch Mercer walk back to his office, didn't see him pour himself a drink that was definitely against hospital policy, didn't need to imagine his satisfaction because she understood exactly what he was thinking, that he'd handled it, that he'd removed the obstacle, that the system worked for people like him because people like him had spent their entire lives making sure it did. She was still standing there 72 hours later when the hospital called. Not Mercer. Someone higher. Someone at the Pentagon level. Someone who said her presence was required for federal review and that her temporary reinstatement was effective immediately and that nobody at Cedar Creek Medical was going to ask questions about why a decorated combat veteran who'd been terminated for assault was being brought back by direct order. The general's name was Robert Castellano. 2 stars. Dress uniform that looked like it had been pressed by someone who understood precision. He arrived during evening rounds when she was checking medication interactions for a patient in the secure ward. Khalid al-Mahdi, the Taliban commander, the intelligence asset, the man whose testimony about black site medical experiments could change everything if he stayed alive long enough to give it. Al-Mahdi's eyes found her first. Then his face went absolutely white. The color drained out like someone had pulled a plug. He whispered in Pashto first, words that meant nothing to the night shift nurses but meant everything to her, then switched to English with an accent thick as grief. Desert Angel. The woman who cut me from wreckage and gave me blood during the siege. A Marine lieutenant named Scott Derringer was visiting his brother in the bed next to Al-Mahdi's. Young guy, early 20s, the kind of warrior who still had that look that said he hadn't yet understood what he'd lived through. He was sitting there with his phone when those words came out, and his head snapped up like he'd heard something that mattered. He pulled up his phone. Started reading. Bronze Star with Valor. Awarded to Captain Natalie Hayes for extraordinary heroism while serving as ranking medical officer during a 12-hour siege in Kandahar province where she personally treated 43 casualties under direct fire. That's when Mercer came through the door like he'd been waiting for this exact moment, like he still owned this space, like rank and decoration meant nothing against the weight of institutional power. This is a patient care area. You're disrupting. The elevator doors opened behind him. General Castellano stepped out in dress uniform that looked like it had been formed from the concept of command itself. His voice cut through the hallway like a scalpel through scar tissue. Attention. Mercer's mouth closed. His body straightened automatically, years of military culture written into his bones even though he'd left that world for money and titles that felt more important. The general walked past him like Mercer was made of air. He approached Natalie at the medication cart, and his movement was deliberate, ceremonial, the kind of walking that meant something was about to happen that would change the available futures in this space. He stopped at attention in front of her. And he saluted. A full military salute. The fist to chest. The gesture that said, I recognize you. I acknowledge what you've done. I understand what you carry. David Chen stepped forward from where he'd been pretending not to watch from the corner. Captain Hayes performed 43 emergency surgical interventions during that 12-hour engagement, sir. I was medevaced on hour 8. She stayed the full duration. His voice had changed. The traveling nurse accent was gone. What remained was the precision of someone speaking for the record. Khalid Omodi spoke again, his hand shaking. She gave me her own blood when supplies ran out. She argued with commanders to treat enemy wounded.
I was enemy. She saved me anyway.
The general's voice softened. Captain, the Pentagon sent me to deliver a message. Operation Safeguard is complete. Your witness testified this morning via secure video. Your mission succeeded despite compromise. Lieutenant Derringer kept reading from his phone, and his voice had that quality that happened to young warriors when they understood they'd been standing next to something that mattered. Call sign Guardian Angel. 63 coalition lives saved. 18 enemy combatants treated under fire. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Mercer, standing in that hallway, finally understanding that the system he'd built his entire career on protecting had limits, and those limits were currently standing at attention in front of a 2-star general. The Marine's brother was recording everything on his phone. The 18-second clip of Mercer screaming at a decorated combat veteran in dress uniform would upload within the hour. By morning, it would have 3 million views. The 18-second video clip uploaded at 11:33 p.m. and would have 2 million views by dawn. Dr. Mercer screaming clipboard Connie at a woman in captain's insignia. The general in dress uniform saluting her like she was royalty. The Bronze Star citation hanging in the air while Mercer's face went the color of raw liver. Social media moved fast. Faster than hospital protocols. Faster than damage control. By 6 a.m., the clip had trending hashtags, #HeroNurse, #AbuseVeteran, #WhoIsNatalie. News outlets were already calling Cedar Creek Medical. The hospital switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree that nobody wanted to plug in. Dr. Mercer's phone rang at 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The caller ID read, Arthur Brennan, MD. Mercer hadn't heard from his medical school mentor in 3 months. Before that, Brennan had always been supportive, a voice in the darkness during Mercer's divorce, a character reference when the first audit started, a quiet assurance that doctors made mistakes and the board understood. Brennan had trained him 20 years ago at Johns Hopkins, had written the letters of recommendation that got him hired at Cedar Creek, had called twice a year like clockwork. Mercer answered. I taught you that medicine was service, Brennan said. His voice sounded like a recording of itself. Like a man who'd been rehearsing what he was about to say for hours. Not profit. Not power. Service. Mercer opened his mouth. You've made it extortion, Brennan continued. I saw the video. I read the emails the hospital shared with the board. The fabricated violations. The calls to investigators asking them to find evidence instead of investigating. You don't get to call yourself a doctor, Pierce. Not anymore. Arthur, I can explain. I'm releasing a statement to every major medical publication disowning you professionally. I'm demanding a full ethics review. I'm telling them you were never the student I thought you were. Brennan's voice didn't break. That was the worst part. It didn't break. Don't call me again. The line went dead. Mercer stared at his phone. Brennan was the one person in medicine whose opinion had always mattered. The one person he'd wanted to impress since he was 23 years old. The one person who had defended him through every controversy. The one person whose call at 7:15 a.m. on any given Tuesday would mean everything was still okay. And Natalie Hayes, with her quiet hands and her steady breathing and her 3-year-old faded patch, had just taken that away with 18 seconds of viral video. The hospital board convened an emergency session at 8 a.m. Richard Garrett, the board chairman who'd been Mercer's closest ally, sat in the conference room watching his phone light up with message after message about the trending clip. 47 board members and hospital administrators were already in the chamber. The public relations director was pale. Garrett looked at the email chain in front of him. The one Mercer had sent requesting that the external investigator Stuart Vance find evidence of Natalie's mental instability. The one asking for fabricated violations. The one offering to make it worth his while. Vance had already sent his response to the full board at 6:24 a.m., a retainer check returned, a detailed accounting of every conversation with Mercer, and a single message, I can't be part of this. Garrett raised his hand. I move to suspend Dr. Pierce Mercer's hospital privileges pending a full investigation by the Georgia Medical Board, he said quietly. All in favor? The vote was unanimous. By 10 a.m., the external investigation had turned into something far larger. The billing auditor they'd originally hired to review Mercer's cases came back with numbers that made the hospital's legal team ask for scotch before noon. 47 phantom post-operative appointments. Manipulated procedure codes. Procedures that were never performed, documented as if they'd happened, billed to insurance companies at $7,234 per case. $340,000. Every single fabrication had passed Natalie's desk. Her meticulous charting notes. Her timestamps. Her documentation of which procedures actually occurred and when. Her refusal to sign off on anything she hadn't witnessed. Every note she'd written that Mercer called obsessive and paranoid became a breadcrumb trail that led directly back to his fraud. He'd been counting on her to cut corners. He'd been counting on her to get tired of protocol and sign off on his inflated claims without checking. He'd been counting on her to be just another nurse who wanted to keep her job. Instead, he'd handed them a detailed audit trail written in her careful handwriting, dated and timed, proving exactly which cases he'd falsified. By 2 p.m., the Georgia Medical Board had suspended his license. By 4 p.m., his wife's attorney had filed for separation. By 5:41 p.m., his country club called to inform him his membership was revoked due to conduct unbecoming. By 8 p.m., the news cycle had moved on to other stories, but Mercer's name remained in search results. Dr. Abuse's war hero nurse. The caption would follow him forever. What that night was supposed to look like, Mercer driving home in his Range Rover, turning the key in his house, walking into the kitchen where his wife was making dinner, drinking a scotch in the study while reading the evening news, going to bed certain that tomorrow would be damage control but manageable. What that night actually looked like, Mercer in a hotel room with his suitcase, his wife's lawyer's number on repeat, his medical license suspended, his mentor's statement posted on every medical board in the country, and his hand shaking too much to hold the phone. The statement from Arthur Brennan was simple. Clear. Surgical in its precision. A physician who cannot recognize heroism has no business treating heroes. Natalie didn't watch the video go viral. She didn't read the news articles. She didn't check social media. She continued her shift like the entire trajectory of her life hadn't just pivoted on an 18-second clip of a man screaming at her while a two-star general stood silently in the background. But she felt it. The shift in how people looked at her. The way nurses who'd avoided her now made eye contact. The way the trauma team moved out of her way without asking. The way David Chen found her in the medication room and said simply, "Welcome home, Captain." The way the construction worker whose life she'd saved with a field thoracotomy called from his recovery room to say, "I heard what happened. I heard what he tried to do. I heard what you really are. Thank you. Thank you for not letting him win." 8 months later, Natalie walked past the Cedar Creek Medical loading dock on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The sun was bright. Spring was coming. The world smelled like rain and new grass and the kind of possibility that only comes after winter. She saw him first. Dr. Mercer, in a blue uniform that said Atlanta Medical Supply Distribution, hauling cardboard boxes of 4 bags and chest tubes and Foley catheters into the back of a white delivery van. The van that supplied the hospital he'd once controlled. The same hospital that had removed his name from the directory. The same hospital whose board had sent his file to federal prosecutors. His physician's license was suspended. Pending criminal trial for insurance fraud. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. He looked away first. Inside the hospital, in a corridor that didn't exist 6 months ago, the faded Special Forces unit patch was mounted in a glass frame. The patch that had been sewn inside Natalie's jacket lining when she walked out of this hospital in the rain. The patch that had survived 3 years of undercover work, 3 years of hiding, 3 years of watching a CIA contractor testify from a protected location while pretending it was a patient in the ICU. Below the patch was a bronze plaque, Captain Natalie Hayes, Guardian Angel of Kandahar, Cedar Creek Medical RN. In honor of service beyond measure. In room for 47, the CIA contractor who'd broken the Black Site program testimony had been relocated. Safe. Protected. The mission complete not because of federal oversight, but because 18 seconds of viral video had exposed everything and made the conspiracy too public to continue. Standing in the ambulance bay, where the rain beaded against the glass and the early spring afternoon stretched out in front of them like a second chance, Natalie wasn't alone. Staff Sergeant Marcus Way stood beside her, wearing civilian clothes now, working as the hospital's veterans liaison. One of the 14 soldiers she'd saved during the 12-hour siege in Kandahar. One of the ones she'd sewn together with field-grade precision and hope. "I told you I'd never forget your face," Marcus said quietly. "Took me 3 years to find you. The whole team's been looking." Natalie touched the scar on her forearm. The one from a piece of shrapnel in Kandahar that she'd never had properly removed because removing it would have required explaining how she got it. "Some faces are worth remembering," she said. David Chen approached with her new badge. Clinical Training Director. The title meant she'd be teaching every nurse in the hospital that 3-layer closure technique. The technique that had stopped the bleeding when the construction worker arrived with rebar through his chest. The technique that had exposed Mercer's incompetence the moment the machine measured the blood loss stopping instead of continuing. As Natalie pinned on the badge, the intercom crackled to life. "Trauma alert! Trauma alert! ETA 3 minutes. 34-year-old male, motor vehicle accident, ejected from vehicle, blunt force trauma, vital stable." Natalie's hands were already moving. Grabbing the trauma shears from her pocket. Checking the airway equipment. Verifying the crash cart. Her voice steady. Her movements precise. Her presence in the room like the difference between chaos and order. Every staff member stepped aside as she walked toward the ER. Not because they were afraid anymore. Because they understood. The quiet person in the room. The one who pushed a cart and said nothing and documented everything and refused to compromise integrity for protocol. The one they'd written violations for. The one their hero of a doctor had screamed at. The one who turned out to be holding it all together. The final image is her reflection in the trauma bay window as she passes through. No longer invisible. No longer just a nurse. Finally visible. Finally herself. Finally home. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, Natalie Hayes just became your hero tonight. If you've ever had a boss try to destroy you for doing the right thing and wondered if integrity was actually worth the cost, watch what happens when the truth comes out. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment below, what would you have done in Natalie's position when Mercer first started the fabrications? Did she handle it right? And if you want more stories about quiet warriors who change everything, hit that notification bell. We post new ones every week.